Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov was the most brilliant general of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. Architect of the victory over Japan in the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, he would save his homeland in the Battle of Moscow, change the course of the war in the Battle of Stalingrad, and deliver the final blow to the Third Reich in the Battle of Berlin. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was born on the 1st of December of 1896 in Strelkovka, a town in the Kaluga district, then part of the Russian Empire. Coming from a very poor family, his father was a shoemaker named Konstantin Zhukov, and his mother, a farmer named Ustinina Aktemievna. He had an older sister, Maria Zhukov, and a brother, Alexei Zhukov. Because his family faced considerable economic hardship, Zhukov had to begin working at the age of 8 to help pay the rent for their home, which consisted of a humble ground floor dwelling with just one room and a dirt floor. Fortunately, he was able to receive an education while working, as he attended evening classes where he learned to read and write, as well as other subjects such as history, and in particular, military affairs, which became a special passion of his. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Zhukov enlisted in the cavalry of the Imperial Russian Army at the age of 18. With no difficulties in his enrollment, in 1915, he was assigned to the 10th Novgorod Dragoon Regiment before being sent to the Eastern Front, where he distinguished himself in combat, earning promotion to sergeant and being awarded the Cross of St. George for his bravery. When the Bolshevik Revolution broke out in October of 1917, the Provisional Government of Alexander Kerensky ordered the horsemen of the 10th Novgorod Dragoon Regiment to charge against the revolutionary workers and peasants. However, Zhukov's unit, sympathetic to Vladimir Lenin's ideas, refused to obey the order and joined the rebels. As a result, he was appointed by his fellow soldiers as delegate of the Regimental Soviet. From that moment, he fought alongside the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, taking command of the 3rd Cossack Regiment from 1918 to 1921, and being promoted to brigade commander that same year. Among his notable contributions to the conflict was the crushing of the Tambov Rebellion in 1921, where he distinguished himself by defeating the socialist peasants who had risen against the Bolsheviks. Once the Russian Civil War ended in 1924 with the Red Army's victory and the founding of the Soviet Union, Zhukov left active service to study at the Frunze Military Academy. A few years later, he graduated from the Higher Cavalry School, and in 1933 he was appointed military inspector with the rank of general. The following year, in 1934, he took command of the 4th Cavalry Division, while in 1938, after surviving Joseph Stalin's Great Purge, during which his comrade Mikhail Tukhachevsky was executed, he was given command of the Belarusian military district. Outside of military life, General Georgy Zhukov also formed his own family, first marrying Alexandra Zuykova, a marriage that would end in divorce, and later Galina Alexandrova, a doctor with whom he would share the rest of his life. Regarding his descendants, Zhukov had a total of 4 daughters named Era, Margarita, Ella, and Maria. At the beginning of the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol in the summer of 1939 between the Soviet Union and Outer Mongolia against Japan and Manchukuo, General Georgy Zhukov, still unknown to many Soviets, was sent to the Far East to prevent the Japanese from penetrating Mongolian territory. Miraculously, and against all odds, the young officer, in whom no one in his own ranks had placed any faith, stopped the advance of the Imperial Japanese Army along a front of 750 kilometers and prepared a meticulous counterattack by transferring large reserves from the rear, moving his men at night to avoid suspicion, and having his own troops study a manual he himself had written, entitled What the Soviet Soldier Must Know in Defense. Thus, on the 20th of August of 1939, Zhukov's Red Army launched an offensive that easily overran enemy positions, broke through the Manchurian border, and destroyed the 11th Japanese Army in the Nomohan Pocket. That unexpected victory, which inflicted 50,000 casualties on the Japanese at the cost of 26,000 Soviet losses, resulted in a peace treaty with Japan and the awarding of the Medal of Hero of the Soviet Union to Zhukov. With the situation in the Far East resolved, Zhukov took part in the invasion of Bessarabia against Romania in 1940, leading the Red Army against the few Romanian forces who were easily defeated. In the following months and early in 1941, Zhukov began to suspect the possibility of a war against Germany, which is why he proposed to Joseph Stalin both defensive measures on the border and even a preemptive strike. 2 proposals that failed, since the Soviet leader was absolutely convinced of his friendship with Adolf Hitler. On the 22nd of June of 1941, more than 4 million Axis soldiers invaded the Soviet Union in what became known as Operation Barbarossa. Astonishingly, Stalin himself believed it was merely a temporary tantrum of Hitler with whom he could reach an agreement. Something Zhukov tried to show was a mistake during a heated verbal confrontation that ended badly, since the Soviet leader, convinced of his thesis, lost 3 weeks of precious time during which millions of Red Army troops fell. Unfortunately, by the time Stalin realized his error and appointed Zhukov as a member of the General Staff, Stavka, the defeat of Kiev had already occurred, costing 1 million Soviet casualties and bringing the German army close to Moscow. Fortunately, Zhukov's advice, such as reinforcing the Arctic sector against Finland in Karelia, organizing partisans in the rear, and delaying 150,000 German soldiers for several days at the Battle of Smolensk, prevented a total collapse of the Eastern Front. Moscow became the final objective of the German army, Wehrmacht, before its ultimate victory over the USSR. And for that reason, General Zhukov convinced Stalin that the decisive battle had to be fought around the capital. Thus, after 700,000 Soviet soldiers were annihilated in the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets, Zhukov managed to delay the enemy's advance long enough to mobilize the entire population of Moscow in the construction of defenses and take advantage of the winter, which covered the roads with snow and froze the German machinery. Thanks to this tactic, the Soviets gained 2 months of time and transferred from the Far East the Siberian Army to launch a counteroffensive on the 5th of December of 1941, when the enemy was only 16 kilometers from the capital. In this way, Zhukov crushed the German vanguards and captured numerous prisoners, pushing the army group north back more than 140 kilometers from the city and emerging as the victor of the Battle of Moscow, thus becoming the first general to defeat the German army on land in the Second World War. When Army Group South launched Operation Blue against the USSR, which brought Axis forces into half of the Caucasus and locked them into the Battle of Stalingrad, a bloody urban war lasting from the summer until the autumn of 1942, Marshal Georgy Zhukov took command of the Red Army on the far side of the Volga River, while secretly assembling a massive force of 1,101,000 soldiers, 675 tanks, 10,250 guns, and 1,216 aircraft. Under the name Operation Uranus, on the 19th of November, he launched a pincer counteroffensive that destroyed the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, and on the 21st his vanguards linked up at Sovietsky, encircling the German 4th Army inside Stalingrad itself. Following this maneuver, Zhukov tightened the siege of the city and launched further offensives, which also destroyed the Italian 8th Army and the Hungarian 2nd Army along the Don River. Under this pressure, and subjected to hunger and the harsh winter climate, the soldiers of the German 6th Army finally surrendered on the 2nd of February of 1943. This disaster, which cost the Axis 800,000 casualties at the price of 1,200,000 Soviet losses, was Zhukov's greatest military triumph to that date and the key turning point that shifted the course of the Second World War. Obsessively, the Third Reich returned to the offensive in the summer of 1943 in what became known as Operation Citadel, in a sector between Kursk and Orel, for which Georgy Zhukov, recently promoted to field marshal, was responsible. Since Zhukov had already anticipated a movement in that area, he organized a formidable horseshoe-shaped defense composed of dense minefields, trench networks, explosive traps, and a significant reserve of armored units. Thus unfolded the Battle of Kursk, considered the largest tank battle in history, in which, although the Soviets suffered far greater casualties due to the introduction of the new Tiger and Panther tanks, which outclassed the Russian T-34, the losses inflicted by Zhukov on the Germans forced them to abandon the offensive and yield the initiative to the Red Army. Thanks to the victory in the Battle of Kursk, Zhukov pursued the German army through Ukraine, recovering a considerable stretch of lost territory such as the cities of Orel or Kharkov, crossing the Dnieper River, and liberating the capital of Kiev in December of 1943. He also organized the breaking of the siege of Leningrad in 1944, after expelling the Finnish German besiegers, and regained much of Western Russia, which earned him the nicknames given by his soldiers such as Savior, Spasitel, Battering Ram, Hurricane, or Invincible. Under the name Operation Bagration, on June 22nd of 1944, Marshal Georgy Zhukov organized the largest offensive of the Red Army in the Second World War, with 2,331,000 soldiers, 4,070 tanks, 31,000 cannons or mortars, and 6,339 airplanes. In this way, buried first by the initial artillery bombardment and then overwhelmed by Russian tanks and infantry, the German troops suffered one of their greatest defeats due to the 400,000 casualties compared to the 765,000 of the Red Army, as well as the territorial loss of Belarus, eastern Poland, western Ukraine, and Lithuania. At the beginning of 1945, Georgy Zhukov launched the final offensive against the heart of the Third Reich, first expelling the Germans from the Vistula River and Warsaw, then conquering Poland and East Prussia, and finally entering the German borders. However, from that point onward, Joseph Stalin tried to obtain personal political gains from the campaign, and therefore recklessly encouraged competition among his three favorite marshals. Zhukov in command of the First Belarusian Front, Ivan Konev of the First Ukrainian Front, and Konstantin Rokossovsky of the Second Belarusian Front. This absurd decision by Stalin cost thousands of Soviet lives in the crossing of the Oder River and the capture of the Silo Heights, although in the long run, it favored Zhukov because, after the activation of Order 11,074, the Marshal was the first to begin the Battle of Berlin, conquer the city, and finally raise the red flag of the USSR over the German parliament, Reichstag, on May 2nd of 1945. Once the Second World War in Europe ended in May of 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov was one of the highest-ranking military leaders to preside over the Victory Parade in Red Square in Moscow, held on June 10th. However, Joseph Stalin, fearing that Zhukov would become too popular among the Russian people to the detriment of his own figure, overshadowed the Marshal's fame through an intense and falsified propaganda campaign by which the Soviet leader himself claimed the laurels of triumph over Germany. As a reward for his services in the Second World War, Stalin appointed Zhukov head of the High Commission of Germany, which oversaw the eastern part of the country, a post in which he strengthened ties with the United States, Great Britain, and France, and also met with important figures such as the American General David Eisenhower, the English Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and the French General Jean de La Tassigny. Little by little, Zhukov's fame grew not only among Russians, but also among the Western Allies. This greatly worried Stalin, as there was a risk that the Soviet people might see Zhukov as the victor of the war rather than himself. For that reason, he removed Zhukov from his responsibilities in Germany, and to everyone's surprise, gave him military command of the Ural district. However, rather than a reward, his new post was more of a punishment, and Zhukov himself considered it an unjust forced exile. After Stalin's death in 1953 and the beginning of the de-Stalinization process, under the new president Georgy Malenkov, the new authorities transferred Zhukov from the Urals and stationed him in Moscow to prevent a highly probable coup d'etat by Lavrenti Beria, at that time Stalin's most loyal follower, who aspired to succeed him. Immediately, Zhukov, in command of the Red Army in the capital, managed to bring the entire state police, NKVD, under his control and arrested Beria, who would later be tried, with Zhukov testifying before the court, and executed, thus bringing an end to the Stalinist era. In 1955, Zhukov was appointed Minister of Defense of the USSR under the new cabinet of President Nikolai Bulganin. During his time in this post, he supported opening relations with the West, which is why he met again with his old acquaintance, the American David Eisenhower, recently elected President of the United States, to whom he gave a fishing kit. At the same time, he reinforced ties with other communist countries, for example, through a voyage aboard the cruiser Kuibyshev to Albania and Yugoslavia, where he visited leaders Enver Hoxha and Josip Tito, respectively. He also supported the trials to restore the memory of all of Stalin's victims, including several of his comrades who had been murdered during the Great Purge, such as Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Nikita Khrushchev, the new secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, CPSU, removed Zhukov from the Ministry of Defense in 1957. A decade later, in 1965, he was called again by the cabinet of President Leonid Brezhnev, while the following year, in 1966, he was awarded the Order of Lenin in a tumultuous ceremony in Red Square. Unexpectedly, in 1967, Zhukov suffered a cerebrovascular health problem that forced him to leave active service permanently and retire due to illness. From then on, he was treated at home by his wife, Dr. Galina Alexandrova, leading a very peaceful and domestic life in which he engaged in activities such as answering the many letters of his military admirers or writing a work he titled Memoirs and Battles, published in 1969. On June 18th of 1974, the life of Georgy Zhukov came to an end forever, and his body was subsequently buried with full national honors in the mausoleum of Red Square in Moscow. With him passed one of the greatest heroes of the Soviet Union, and without a doubt one of the most brilliant military leaders of the Second World War, Konstantin Rokossovsky, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky was one of the great military leaders of the Soviet Union in the 20th century. A veteran of the Great War and the Russian Civil War, he was the architect of victory in the Chinese Eastern Railway War and one of the greatest contributors to the triumphs of the Red Army throughout the entire Second World War. Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky was born on December 21st of 1896 in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, which at that time was part of the Russian Empire. Coming from a noble family that had chosen a modest life, in fact his real name was Konstantin Ksawerowicz Rokossovsky. His father was a Polish railway officer named Ksawery Rokossovsky, and his mother was a Belarusian homemaker named Antonina Ovsianikova. At only 14 years old, Rokossovsky began working in a factory to earn a living, and later as a laborer in a stone quarry. Although his life seemed destined to be monotonous, by good fortune, and after deciding to try his luck by enlisting in the Russian army, he was admitted to the St. Andrew Military School in St. Petersburg. Once in the academy, he soon demonstrated his excellent skills as a horseman, and was therefore accepted into the cavalry, where he stood out as an exceptional cadet. When the First World War began in 1914, after Russia's declaration of hostilities against Germany and Austria-Hungary, Rokossovsky was assigned to the 5th Dragoon Cavalry Regiment Kargopol and sent to the Eastern Front. Thus, between 1915 and 1916, he fought both the German army and the Austro-Hungarian army across Poland, Belarus, and Galicia, managing during the fighting to rise to the rank of officer and earn the Cross of St. George. With the outbreak of the Russian Civil War in 1917, Rokossovsky, who at that time had just turned 23 years old, joined Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Party and also the Red Army, where he was placed in command of the Kargopol Red Guards Cavalry Squadron. His role during the Ural Mountains campaign in 1918 was decisive, as he managed to expel Admiral Alexander Kolchak's White Army from the region and was subsequently awarded the Order of the Red Banner. He was less fortunate during the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1920, as Rokossovsky's cavalry was swept aside by the Polish army, a defeat that affected him psychologically, since he had failed to bring Bolshevik thought to his native land. Despite the setback in Poland, the Russian Civil War continued in other theaters such as Siberia, where Rokossovsky's 35th Independent Cavalry Regiment pursued white troops until defeating them at Irkutsk. He eventually took part in the invasion of Mongolia, assisting the Mongolian leader Damdin Sukbatar in seizing power and founding Outer Mongolia, which soon became a satellite state of Soviet Russia. Once the Russian Civil War ended in 1923, Rokossovsky entered the Frunze Military Academy with the aim of improving his mastery of war tactics. Interestingly, the head of the academy was one of the Red Army's most famous generals, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, with whom Rokossovsky developed a strong friendship. Thanks to his background in the Russian Civil War and his effective collaboration with Tukhachevsky, Rokossovsky was chosen as a liaison officer of the General Staff and head of the Polish section of the Communist International Comintern of the Polish Communist Party. Later, he was sent to Outer Mongolia to train volunteers of the Eastern Red Clan, and at the same time, to modernize the ranks of the Mongolian People's Army. Outside the political and military sphere, Konstantin Rokossovsky married a woman named Julia Barmanen in 1923. The marriage produced a daughter, whom they named Ariadna. At the start of the Chinese Eastern Railway War in 1929, a border conflict between Kuomintang, China, and a coalition formed by the Soviet Union and Outer Mongolia, Rokossovsky, who at that time was in the Far East, was immediately placed in command of a mixed Russo-Mongolian military force with which he confronted Chinese troops along the railway line. In less than a year, by 1930, Rokossovsky's soldiers not only expelled the Kuomintang from the area, but also annihilated the warlord Zhang Shuiliang's bandits. As a reward for this victory in Asia, the Kremlin promoted Rokossovsky to the rank of general and gave him command of the 7th Samara Cavalry Division. The Great Purge of 1937, through which Joseph Stalin eliminated the leadership of the Red Army and cadres of the Soviet Communist Party, CPSU, claimed one of Rokossovsky's best friends, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who was arrested, subjected to a sham trial, and executed. In fact, because of his friendship with Tukhachevsky, Rokossovsky himself was also arrested along with all the members of the Polish Communist Party. Although, miraculously, he had the fortune of being the only one of his comrades not to be executed, since his death sentence was commuted at the last moment to life imprisonment in Kresty Prison, located on the outskirts of Leningrad. Rokossovsky remained imprisoned in Kresty for a total of 4 years, until Operation Barbarossa, launched by the Third Reich against the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, changed his fate. As a result of the constant defeats of the Red Army in the Baltic states, Belarus and Ukraine, due in part to the poor quality of the officer corps after the Great Purge, it became necessary to release most of the generals behind bars, including Rokossovsky, whose sentence was forgiven in exchange for achieving good results on the battlefield against the until then invincible German army, Wehrmacht. Initially, General Konstantin Rokossovsky was given command of the 16th Soviet Army, a modest formation composed of penal battalions, Strafbats, since Joseph Stalin still did not trust him so soon after his release from prison. However, against all expectations for such a weak force as the 16th Army, Rokossovsky surprised everyone by masterfully leading his men during the Battle of Moscow in December of 1941, specifically in the defense of the Volokholamsk sector, decisively contributing alongside General Georgy Zhukov to the victory over the German army that prevented the Third Reich from seizing the Russian capital. In fact, the following year, at the beginning of 1942, Rokossovsky again stood out as a brilliant commander, covering the retreat of the Red Army around Bryansk and the Don River. In the winter of 1942 to 1943, Joseph Stalin's confidence in Rokossovsky was complete, and thus he entrusted him with command of the Don Front during the Battle of Stalingrad, where he orchestrated the destruction of General Italo Garibaldi's 8th Italian Army, inflicting 114,000 casualties. Shortly afterward, during the Battle of Kursk, Rokossovsky was also one of the generals who halted the German army's offensive in Operation Citadel, in addition to coordinating excellently with Marshal Zhukov to cross the Dnieper River, reconquer Ukraine, and retake the capital Kiev. A year after this victory, in the summer of 1944, Rokossovsky led the First Belarusian Front in Operation Bagration, which expelled Axis forces from Belarus and cornered them in Poland, earning him promotion to the rank of Marshal. Unfortunately, and against his wishes, during the Warsaw Uprising, he had to halt his vanguard forces at the very gates of his native city, since Stalin preferred that the Germans crush the Polish resistance, Armia Krajowa, to save the Soviets the effort, something that left Rokossovsky deeply shaken when, in January of 1945, he entered the metropolis with his men and found nothing but ruins. At the beginning of the Red Army's final offensive against Germany in 1945, the Second Belarusian Front, led by Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, occupied East Prussia and its capital located in the port city of Königsberg. Immediately afterward, he directed his columns toward the Baltic Sea coast, where his troops were involved in a series of massacres and rapes of German women that were reported in the press, a scandal for which he was criticized due to his awareness of the events and his failure to take action. Finally, after a long march, Rokossovsky's soldiers linked up in northern Germany with the vanguards of the British Second Army under Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Once the Second World War ended in May of 1945, Rokossovsky had the honor of participating alongside the American Army and the British Army in the Berlin Victory Parade, and shortly afterward, in the Moscow Victory Parade held on June 24th, he preceded his troops on horseback across Red Square, where they threw the captured banners at Stalin's feet. With the proclamation of the People's Republic of Poland as a satellite state of the USSR, Konstantin Rokossovsky's Polish nationality was used to appoint him honorarily as Marshal of Poland, and at the same time, Minister of National Defense of Poland. From then on, his work essentially consisted of dismantling Poland's old culture and traditions, which were replaced by socialist ideology, something incomprehensible in many cases to a predominantly Catholic and rural nation. In fact, the native population never held much sympathy for Rokossovsky, as he was seen as a traitor subjugated to the Russian occupier. For this reason, they nicknamed him Adam Czartoryski, a historical Polish figure who, after the Napoleonic Wars at the Congress of Vienna in 1814, handed the country over to Imperial Russia under Tsar Alexander I. However, despite all accusations of treason, Rokossovsky sought to Russify Poland as little as possible, though always discreetly in order not to attract Stalin's attention. For example, when he rebuilt the Polish army, he preserved the original uniforms of the previous regime and also prevented the entry of Soviet instructors or advisors into the officer corps. Some of the darkest aspects of Rokossovsky's career were without doubt the acts of repression he was forced to carry out in Poland, under direct orders from Moscow. Among the most scandalous was the deportation of 200,000 people to concentration camps and gulags in Siberia, where thousands lost their lives and the rest were turned into forced labor slaves. Regarding the former Polish resistance of the Second World War, all its members were persecuted and its veterans executed or deported. Not even those who dared to criticize such practices survived, as happened during the workers' protests in Poznan in 1956, when Rokossovsky sent 10,000 soldiers and 360 tanks, which eventually crushed the strike and killed 74 demonstrators. When President Nikita Khrushchev abolished Stalinism in the USSR in 1956, the new Kremlin authorities drew up blacklists on which appeared the name of Konstantin Rokossovsky, despite the fact that he himself had been a victim of Joseph Stalin during the Great Purge of 1937. At that time, Moscow sought to assign responsibility, and for that reason, Rokossovsky was dismissed from his posts in Poland, being replaced by Ladislaw Gomulka. Fortunately, after his case was reviewed, Nikita Khrushchev ultimately acknowledged Rokossovsky's position and restored to him the title of Marshal of the Red Army. In fact, between July of 1957 and April of 1962, Rokossovsky was appointed Minister of Defense of the USSR during the height of the Cold War, as well as commander of the Transcaucasian Military District. Suddenly, on August 6th of 1968, Konstantin Rokossovsky died at the age of 71. In memory of his role in the Russian Civil War and the Second World War, he was buried with full honors in the mausoleum of Red Square in Moscow. Ivan Konev. Ivan Stepanovich Konev was born on December 28th of 1897 in the village of Lodeno, Vologda, at that time a distant and frozen region of Siberia, which in the 19th century formed part of the Russian Empire. Though destined to be little more than a humble peasant of the lower class, Providence decreed that in the future he would bear the title of one of the marshals who led the Soviet Union to victory during the Second World War. Konev's childhood unfolded under extremely harsh living conditions, both because of his parents' poor financial means and the difficult, frigid climate. From a very young age, he worked cutting tree trunks and performing agricultural tasks in order to survive. In fact, his parents dreamed of seeing their son become a farmer, until, much to their misfortune, Konev chose instead to set out on an adventure by enlisting in the Imperial Russian Army. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Konev went to the Eastern Front in 1916 as an artilleryman in a cannon battery. The following year, coinciding with the Russian Revolution of February 1917, Konev was demobilized and returned home to await further events. It was precisely in Siberia that he hesitated over which side to choose in the Russian Civil War, until in 1919 he joined Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Party and enlisted in the Red Army, being appointed Commissar of the Nikolsk district until the White Army was expelled from the region. Once order was restored in Vologda, Konev fought in the ranks of the Red Army under General Semyon Timoshenko, clashing on the Manchurian border in the Far East both against white troops and against soldiers of the Japanese Expeditionary Force. After the Russian Civil War ended, and having joined the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1923, Konev decided to enroll as a simple student at the Frunze Military Academy, even though at the time he already held the rank of Commissar, which he resigned. The decision proved very wise, since in 1926 he successfully completed his studies and was chosen as an instructor at the very same academy that had trained him. Thus, 5 years later, after intensive improvement in military matters, Konev was appointed in 1931 as a senior officer responsible for the Transbaikal region, while in 1934 he was promoted to general and appointed commander of a rifle division. Miraculously, when Joseph Stalin initiated the Great Purge of 1937 against the Red Army, Konev was one of the few of his rank not to be purged, nor was he even accused of any crime. From then on, with the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe between 1939 and 1940, Konev devoted himself to studying the tactics of blitzkrieg developed by the German general Heinz Guderian, with whom, curiously, he struck up a friendship after meeting him at an international military summit. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, with Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Konev was placed in command of the 19th Soviet Army, deployed in northern Russia. His first mission was to stop the Finnish army's offensive during the continuation war in the border regions with Finland, Karelia, and Lake Ladoga. Immediately afterward, he covered the Red Army's retreat following the German army's occupation of Smolensk, and later participated in the defense of the capital during the Battle of Moscow between late 1941 and early 1942. With the arrival of 1943, General Ivan Konev was appointed to command the Second Ukrainian Front, with which he achieved significant victories during the Battle of Kursk, the reconquest of Kharkov, and a subsequent 400-kilometer advance deep into Ukraine. However, one of Konev's greatest masterpieces was the crossing of the Dnieper River after the construction of 18 bridges in just one day, an event that earned him the nickname General of the Rivers, because whenever pontoons ran out, he had a series of boats stacked on the water, or even sent swimmers to the opposite bank. In fact, for this triumph, which contributed decisively to the reconquest of the capital Kiev, Joseph Stalin promoted Konev to the rank of Marshal of the Field. The advances of Konev's Second Ukrainian Front in 1944 were impressive, as he defeated the Romanian army in Odessa and Bessarabia, broke into the Carpathians, and reached the Romanian border. He also played a very important role in reducing the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket, which inflicted severe damage on the Axis Southern Army Group. While in the summer of 1944, Konev's troops marched relentlessly into Poland, seizing the cities of Lublin, Sandomierz, Lvov, and Przemysl, and crossing the Vistula River. The following year, in 1945, Konev's forces annihilated the Slovak army and occupied Slovakia, before entering the eastern border of Czechia, then turning back into Poland and advancing toward Berlin. Konev's conquests in Eastern Europe were accompanied by numerous crimes committed by the troops of the Second Ukrainian Front against the German civilian population. The motive for the massacres of so many innocent citizens stemmed from an announcement that Konev himself made upon learning that his mother and sister had been killed by German soldiers. His words were as follows: "Kill, men of the Red Army, kill. Every German, whether in diapers or yet to be born, is an enemy. Kill, men of the Red Army." On April 1st of 1945, Joseph Stalin summoned Marshals Ivan Konev and Georgy Zhukov to the Kremlin to settle the question of which of the two would be responsible for occupying the capital of Berlin, with the task ultimately falling to Zhukov to Konev's frustration. Despite this, and motivated by a desire to outshine his colleague, toward whom he had long harbored antipathy, Konev became the first marshal to step into the capital of Berlin when his troops crossed the Forst River and entered the outskirts of Belitz and Potsdam, also securing the districts of Schonenberg and Wilmersdorf, where he destroyed 2 German divisions. Unfortunately, Stalin invoked Order 11,074, which commanded Konev to stop before the capital of the Third Reich, before the Siberian marshal could turn west to encircle Ketsin, and subsequently reach the Elbe River to link up with the vanguards of the American army. After the Second World War ended in 1945, Konev was appointed commander-in-chief of the Red Army's occupation forces in Austria, establishing his headquarters in Vienna and sharing the capital with troops from the United States, Great Britain, and France. He remained there until 1950, when he was tasked with rebuilding the Czechoslovak army following Czechoslovakia's entry into the Warsaw Pact, a duty he carried out successfully until 1953. The death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 and the rise of Nikita Khrushchev to the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party favored Konev's recognition for all his merits during the Second World War, which had previously been concealed by the Soviet General Staff. Indeed, as a declared anti-Stalinist, Konev participated in the trial against the head of the state police, NKVD, Lavrenti Beria, who was sentenced to death and executed on December 14th of 1953. Between 1955 and 1960, Marshal Ivan Konev held the rank of Commander-in-Chief of the Warsaw Pact Armed Forces, which included a massive military force composed of the armies of the Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania, and East Germany. Curiously, one of his last military interventions during this period was his role in the Hungarian Revolution in Budapest, where, with his troops and tanks, he dispersed the demonstrations and crushed the protesting students and workers who were denouncing the inefficiency of the communist system, the lack of freedoms, and severe economic shortages. After the fall of Nikita Khrushchev's government as General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, Konev finally retired from the Red Army in 1964. From then on, he withdrew with his wife, Natalia Konev, to the town of Arkhangelskoye, where he lived in a beautiful white-walled country house surrounded by magnificent fir trees. It was precisely in this peaceful setting, amidst nature, that he devoted his time to writing memoirs, which he titled Year of Victory. Ivan Konev died after an illness on June 12th of 1973 at the age of 75. Alongside other heroes of the Soviet Union, and in honor of his memory, the Marshal was buried with full honors at the Kremlin Wall in Moscow.